see some familiar faces. First of all, I just want to start by saying anytime you're asked to return to a place that you helped build.
There are moments in sports that stop everything. Moments where the noise disappears, the crowd holds its breath, and suddenly nothing else exists except one person, one choice, one message. This is one of those moments. Music. Because what just emerged from the Indiana Fever organization is not simply a statement. It is not just a press release carefully constructed by a communications team. What Fever President Kelly Krauskopf just delivered to the world regarding Caitlin Clark's 2026 season is something that players, fans, music analysts, and even skeptics simply cannot afford to overlook. And if you believe you already know what she said, think again. Because the real story runs far deeper than the headlines. Far deeper music than what most people are actually willing to say out loud. Let's go back. Let's rewind to the moment everyone assumed they understood Caitlin Clark. It was the spring of 2024. She had just completed one of the most electrifying college careers in the entire history of American basketball. She had shattered records. She had built a following. She had transcended the sport before she ever stepped onto a professional court for a single minute. The WNBA draft night felt like a coronation. She went first overall to Indiana. A franchise with a proud and storied history, but one that had been searching, genuinely, desperately searching for something to reignite music, And here she was. Think about what that kind of pressure actually feels like. You are 22 years old. Every camera in the building is locked onto you. Every expectation that the league has spent years carefully constructing is now sitting directly on your shoulders. You are not simply music, expected to perform well. You are expected to rescue franchises, revive interest, sell tickets, pack arenas, and reshape the cultural conversation surrounding women's basketball entirely. That is not a basketball assignment. That is something else altogether. That is a burden that would crush most people before they ever laced up their very first pair of professional sneakers. And yet, music, she played. She showed up. She competed. And what unfolded next became one of the defining sports narratives of the modern era. The 2024 WNBA season was not a flawless fairy tale for Caitlin Clark. That must be stated plainly and without any softening whatsoever. There were struggles. There were moments of difficult adjustment. The professional game is different. Faster in certain ways, more physical in others, and relentlessly unforgiving in ways that college basketball simply never is. Defenders who had studied her film for months arrived in games with specific, detailed strategies designed to neutralize everything she does best. She was fouled hard. She was challenged physically. She was tested in ways that college basketball could never have fully prepared her for. And yet, here is what the numbers genuinely say, stripped of all narrative and completely free from agenda. Caitlin Clark, in her rookie WNBA season, averaged over 19 points per game. She led the entire league in assists. She set a rookie scoring record that had stood untouched for decades and then demolished it entirely. She became the first rookie in WNBA history to record multiple 30-point performances. She was not simply good. She was historically productive. And the Fever, a franchise that had been buried in irrelevance for years, suddenly became must-watch television from one coast to the other. But here is precisely what the numbers cannot capture. Here is what the box score will never tell you. Caitlin Clark fundamentally transformed the economic reality of the Indiana Fever, and by extension, the economic reality of the entire WNBA. Road game attendance records collapsed one after another as she traveled into opposing cities. Merchandise sales surged in ways the league had genuinely never witnessed from any single player before. Television ratings climbed. Streaming numbers exploded dramatically. Arenas that had sat half-empty for years were suddenly selling out weeks ahead of schedule. Her presence constructed an entire financial ecosystem around women's basketball that analysts had only speculated about in theory, but had never actually witnessed at anything remotely approaching the scale. That is not nothing. Music. That is not a footnote buried somewhere in the back of the story. That is a seismic, tectonic shift. But even with everything, even with the records and the ratings and the revenue and the sold-out buildings, there remained a question hovering over everything as the 2024 season concluded and 2025 began its approach. A question that Fever fans, WNBA fans, and even casual observers were genuinely afraid to ask out loud. Could she sustain it? Could the physical demands, the relentless media pressure, the towering expectations, the constant scrutiny, could all of that be managed in a way that actually allowed Caitlin Clark to grow rather than slowly deteriorate? Could a 23-year-old carry all of this indefinitely without breaking? That question was going to get an answer, and the 2025 season would be the one to deliver it. Heading into 2025, the Indiana Fever made meaningful and deliberate changes around Caitlin Clark. Music. They understood with absolute clarity that her continued development demanded real infrastructure. You do not take a generational talent and simply throw them into the flames repeatedly without constructing something real around them. Music, added pieces. They adjusted systems. They built an environment where Clark could evolve not simply as a scorer, not merely as a distributor, but as a fully realized leader of a professional basketball organization. And the results? The results were nothing short of extraordinary. Her shooting efficiency climbed noticeably. Her decision-making sharpened in fourth quarters, which is precisely where basketball games are ultimately decided. She demonstrated a defensive intensity that her critics had long wielded as a talking point against her reputation, and she answered it with something they were completely unprepared for: growth. Genuine, undeniable, fully measurable growth. The Fever evolved into a playoff team with a real identity and a real culture. They were not simply Caitlin Clark's team in name alone. They were her team in practice, in culture, in daily expectation. When games mattered most, she delivered plays. When the moment grew largest, she rose directly to meet it. And still, the story refused to end there. Because great players always encounter another test waiting for them. They always run into the next wall, the next challenge, the next wave of doubt they must stare down and overcome completely. The question that surfaced as 2025 wound toward its conclusion and 2026 began to take its shape was simply this: what comes next for her? What does the actual ceiling look like? Music. And more pressing than anything else, what does the Indiana Fever organization, the people whose entire job is to build around and support Caitlin Clark, truly believe about who she already is and who she is steadily becoming? Kelly Krauskopf answered that question, and she answered it in a manner that absolutely nobody was fully prepared for. Kelly Krauskopf has been embedded in professional basketball for a very long time. She has watched players cycle through organizations. She has witnessed hype cycles rise and collapse entirely. She has observed the machinery of professional sports devour talented individuals carrying enormous expectations and reduce them to cautionary tales nobody wants to tell. She is not a person who speaks carelessly or without intention. She is not someone who manufactures excitement purely for the sake of a press cycle. When Kelly Krauskopf says something definitive about a player, you pay attention, because she genuinely means every word of it. What she communicated about Caitlin Clark's 2026 season was not a standard preseason endorsement. It was not the kind of hollow boilerplate statement that organizations routinely release simply to keep fans engaged throughout the offseason. It was specific. It was pointed. And it carried the full weight of someone who has watched this player up close, every single day, in practice and in competition, and in the quiet spaces between games when the true character of an athlete finally reveals itself. The core of what Krauskopf conveyed was this: Caitlin Clark is entering her 2026 season with a level of preparedness and intentionality that the organization has simply never witnessed from her before. Music. Not during her rookie year, and not during her sophomore campaign either. What they are observing right now is something fundamentally different in kind, not merely in degree. Music. The focus is considerably sharper. The conditioning has reached an entirely different level. The tactical understanding she has developed, not simply of her own game, but of how defenses, music, construct their entire strategies around her and precisely how she can systematically dismantle those strategies piece by piece, has crossed into territory suggesting this is no longer just a developing star. This is a player standing directly on the edge of something truly definitional. Think carefully about what that actually means. Think about what it genuinely says when the president of a franchise, someone with complete and unfiltered visibility into everything a player is doing inside the gym, music, Inside the film room, inside the private meetings with coaches, steps forward and communicates, essentially, that what they are currently witnessing is entirely different from before. That the preparation has fundamentally changed. That the player standing before them today is simply not the same player who walked through their doors 2 years ago, or even 1 single year ago. That is not a press release. That is a deliberate signal. And the people who pay close attention to signals, who genuinely understand that the best franchises in professional sports communicate intentionally through them, should be paying very serious attention right now. Let's talk about what all of this means for the 2026 WNBA season taken as a whole. Because Caitlin Clark's trajectory does not exist inside any kind of vacuum. It exists, music, inside a league that has been transformed in measurable and fully documentable ways entirely because of her presence within it. And as she prepares to enter what could easily become her most impactful professional season music to date, the ripple effects of that preparation extend far beyond the borders of Indiana. Other teams have now had 2 full years to study her thoroughly. Music, 2 complete years to scheme against everything she brings. 2 entire years to construct and refine defensive systems, specifically music, calibrated with the singular purpose of minimizing her impact on games. And that matters enormously. It matters because the greatest players in the history of sports, the ones who genuinely transcend their positions and define entire eras, are not great music, despite the fact that every opposing team knows exactly what they intend to do. They are great precisely because even when the entire world knows, it still simply cannot be stopped. That is the unmistakable mark of a player moving into the territory of genuine greatness. Not the capacity to surprise with something hidden, but rather the ability to execute flawlessly even when absolutely nothing remains concealed. Even when the defense knows completely, even when they have prepared with laser-like specificity, she does it regardless. The reports emerging from Fever training, music, from multiple credible sources well beyond Krauskopf's statement alone, strongly suggest that Clark has spent the entire offseason working with deliberate focus on the specific dimensions of her game that opposing defenses have most aggressively targeted. Her pull-up efficiency coming directly off the dribble. Music, her capacity to operate effectively within tight spaces when pick-and-roll coverage systematically eliminates her preferred angles of attack. Music, her finishing at the rim against length and physicality, which is a skill that genuinely requires years of sustained development against the physical caliber that WNBA defenders consistently bring. She has been completely deliberate in her approach. She has been thoroughly systematic in her process. And perhaps most critically of all, she has demonstrated a rare honesty about exactly what areas of her game still require improvement, in a way that remarkably few athletes operating at her level are ever truly willing to embrace. That honesty is music, not a sign of weakness in any form. That honesty is precisely the quality that separates players who eventually plateau from the players who simply never stop climbing toward something greater. There is something genuinely important to acknowledge here about the broader nature of what Caitlin Clark represents across the entire landscape of women's sports. And this is not a soft or sentiment-driven observation being offered lightly. This is a structural point about how individual athletes, when they arrive at the right moment, possess the genuine power to fundamentally reshape institutions around them. Music. The WNBA is a demonstrably better league because Caitlin Clark plays in it. That is not a remotely controversial statement to make. It is a documented fact supported by every single economic indicator that is currently available. But beyond even that, and this is precisely the dimension that purely transactional analysis consistently fails to capture, the league has simply become a more genuinely interesting league to follow. Individual games carry more weight now. The narratives surrounding teams and players have developed real depth and meaning. Music. The rivalries feel considerably more authentic and earned. When Clark travels into an opposing arena on the road, there is a palpable and unmistakable energy inside that building. Not merely from the fans who arrived specifically to cheer for her, but equally from the fans rooting passionately against her with complete music, conviction, and genuine intensity, which is itself one of the highest tributes to what she has already become as a player and as a presence. You simply do not generate passionate opposition without having first generated passionate and deeply rooted belief. And passionate opposition in professional sports is ultimately what creates lasting legacy over time. She is 2 years into what could realistically become a 15-year professional career of sustained excellence. She has already broken records that stood untouched for entire decades. She has already generated revenue impacts and financial transformations that the league could only have imagined as a distant dream just 5 years ago. And now, according to the Fever president herself, according to the internal organizational signals that franchises send outward when they genuinely believe they are witnessing something rare and special taking shape, she is stepping directly into an entirely new phase of her career. A phase where the foundation beneath her is finally completely solid, where the steep learning curve has been successfully navigated, where the central question is no longer whether she can compete and thrive at this level, but rather just exactly how impossibly high the ceiling above her actually reaches. And here is the undeniable truth about ceilings. Here is the precise thing that makes this message from Krauskopf carry weight far beyond simple organizational enthusiasm or routine off-season optimism. Ceilings in professional sports are almost never discovered until a player physically runs directly into them. The players who were universally projected for greatness and ultimately plateaued well short of it, they collided with their ceiling far sooner than anyone surrounding them ever anticipated. The players who were simply expected to be solid contributors and instead became true legends of the game, they kept discovering that what everyone around them had confidently identified as a ceiling was actually nothing more than a floor, nothing more than the very beginning of the next and higher level waiting above. Nobody knows with absolute certainty where Caitlin Clark's ceiling actually sits. Not her coaches, not her teammates, not the analysts who have dedicated years to studying every dimension of her game, and not even Caitlin Clark herself. That is precisely what makes the 2026 season not simply important, but genuinely and deeply compelling to everyone watching. Because we are witnessing someone who has already accomplished things that once seemed completely impossible now preparing to pursue more things that might still seem impossible, all while being backed by an organization that is now communicating explicitly and entirely without qualification that they believe profoundly in everything that is coming next. Kelly Krauskopf has been embedded in professional basketball long enough to recognize clearly and instinctively the fundamental difference between a player who has comfortably found their level and a player who is still actively in the process of finding it. What she is saying right now, clearly and with obvious intention behind every word, is that Caitlin Clark is still finding it, still ascending steadily, still operating somewhere beneath whatever the actual upper boundary of her true ability ultimately turns out to be. And the 2026 season, carrying the accumulated experience she now possesses, armed with the serious preparation she has fully committed herself to, supported by the deliberate roster construction the Fever have carefully executed around her, is the season where the gap between everything she has already shown the world and everything she is genuinely capable of might finally begin to close in meaningful and visible ways. Now consider carefully what the competition actually looks like heading into this moment. Think about the franchises that have invested significant resources building their defensive systems specifically around containing her, and then think about what happens to those carefully constructed systems when the player they were entirely designed to neutralize keeps relentlessly evolving beyond their original assumptions. Defense in professional basketball, across any form of professional basketball, is fundamentally reactive in its very nature. Music. It responds directly to what a player has already demonstrated on film. It builds its structures around tendencies, around documented habits, around the specific version of the player that existed and performed in previous seasons already past. When a player evolves at a pace that consistently outstrips the defensive adjustments scrambling to keep up with her growth, that is precisely the moment when you witness the kind of statistical explosions that permanently define entire careers. That is the precise moment when the numbers themselves begin to enter historic territory. The Fever understand this dynamic completely. They have reviewed every frame of relevant film. They have conducted the necessary analysis with full rigor. They understand thoroughly the strategic environment their franchise player is preparing to step directly into. And they are communicating genuine organizational confidence not in spite of fully knowing all of that surrounding context, but specifically and directly because of it. Because when you examine honestly what opposing defenses have done to try to limit her, and then you study carefully how Clark has responded and demonstrably grown in direct and measured answer to each of those defensive schemes, the calculus becomes unmistakably clear to anyone willing to look. The trajectory is pointing music, somewhere genuinely significant and worth anticipating. There is also an important teammate dimension present in this story that deserves complete and undivided attention. Music. The players surrounding Caitlin Clark on the Indiana Fever roster are not passive bystanders standing quietly at the edges of her individual narrative. They are active and fully invested participants in a team that carries its own genuine ambitions, its own developing culture, its own clearly established standards for what success must look like. And the living dynamic that exists between a true franchise superstar and the teammates sharing the floor with her, the trust built over time, the constant communication, the shared and unwavering commitment to something meaningfully larger than any individual set of statistics, is perhaps the single most underrated determining factor in whether a talented collection of players ever transforms itself into an actual championship team. What the Fever have worked with genuine purpose to construct over the course of the past 2 complete seasons is an environment where Clark's extraordinary gifts are maximized not through the isolation of one player carrying everything alone, but through the genuine integration of her talents into a functioning whole. Through a system where the offensive weapons surrounding her represent authentic and credible threats, where opposing defenses simply cannot collapse every available resource toward her without paying an immediate and serious price elsewhere on the floor. Music. When that precise balance is finally correct, when the star and her supporting cast have discovered the shared rhythm that consistently makes every single one of them demonstrably better, that is the exact moment when teams begin making deep and memorable runs deep into the postseason. That is when franchises finally lift the trophies they had previously only allowed themselves to dream about quietly. The 2026 season is being framed, both internally within the organization and externally by everyone observing it closely, as the definitive season where everything the Fever have been carefully and deliberately building either fully proves its worth or honestly reveals its true limitations to the world. And Kelly Krauskopf's message, delivered directly, with unmistakable confidence, and with music-pointed specificity of language, tells you with complete clarity exactly where this organization stands on that fundamental question. They are not simply hoping for a favorable outcome. They are not carefully hedging their public position to protect themselves. Music. They are declaring something outright and without hesitation. Let's bring this entire conversation back to the individual at the heart of it all. Let's bring it back to the actual human being standing at the very center of everything being discussed. Because in sports, music, as in every meaningful dimension of human experience, the human story is ultimately the only story that carries any real and lasting weight. Statistics are nothing more than the visible expressions of sustained human effort applied over time. Championships are the direct product of collective human will refusing to yield at critical moments. And what Caitlin Clark has demonstrated across 2 complete professional seasons and one of the most relentlessly scrutinized careers in the entire recorded history of women's sports is a fundamentally human capacity for focus and genuine resilience that reaches well beyond what most people, including most professional athletes operating at the highest levels, ever manage to locate within themselves. She has been doubted openly and repeatedly. She has been subjected to sharp and sustained criticism from multiple directions. She has been targeted by narratives and takes that would have completely derailed less grounded and less centered individuals long before now. She has music. Competed through significant physical punishment on the court without complaint. She has answered hostile environments directly with performances that effectively silenced the hostility surrounding her. She has grown visibly and measurably in the full and unforgiving glare of public attention, which is considerably harder than it ever sounds to describe, because growth conducted in public inevitably includes stumbling conducted in public as well, and every stumble immediately becomes a headline waiting to be written. Every difficult game transforms instantly into a sweeping referendum on whether the entire extraordinary project was ever genuinely real in the first place. And through absolutely all of it, she has remained completely focused on the things she actually controls, on her preparation each day, on her execution when the moment arrives, on the intimate details of her craft that,